Good morning. I'm Becky Malby. I'm a professor at London South Bank University on health systems innovation. I'm going to talk to you this morning a little about networks of change. So how do we use networks to support significant change in the NHS? And I've just got some slides to share with you. Here we go. Okay, just make me a little smaller. There. Alrighty, so you're all involved in networks, you've got some passion for networks, you've got some experience of leading networks. The issue is, what difference can they make? And what do we know about collaborations and networks that can inform our practice as leaders? So firstly, let's just have a look at the types of networks. You're familiar with this, or you should be familiar with this from your own network leadership programs. Just move me up a wee bit. There we go. So you know there are basically four types of networks, the delivery development networks. These are probably best categorised in the current NHS by the accountable care systems. Those are primarily peer-based leadership groups supporting change in a system with accountability spread across the partners. So there's an agreed task, and that's usually some level, they call it transformation, but some level of change that has to be agreed across all the members. Where everybody has to give up some territory, where you need to deliver services together and no one person is in charge. So those are delivery and support networks. Then there's learning networks, and you'll be more familiar with these. Most professional networks are learning networks. This here in the room today is a learning network. So there's learning, experimenting, there's collaboration between members, but it's in service to knowledge. So there's a very strong knowledge management function in this network. Knowledge management is a feature of all networks, but it's particularly strong here. There's a lot of attention paid to it. And with learning and support networks, you're really thinking about how do you amplify the impact of individual members in their own places of work. And you might use it to ensure that there is spread of learning across multiple folk. My Innovation Health Network is primarily a learning network. Agency and advocacy networks, those are networks that are really about amplifying members' voices. So they're the sort of networks you want to join if you want to have a say, but your voice is too small. So you might be maybe a Citizens Group or Diabetes UK, where they're trying to advance the cause of people who have diabetes. And then finally, there's a group called Managed Networks. This is only available in the NHS. It's not a language in use outside the NHS, and for me they're not networks. These are projects. These are ways of organising with very strong dedicated management, quite a hierarchy, a core group that makes the decisions. There's some division of labour. So for me, these aren't pure networks. These are much more like a partnership or a partnership form. Okay, so those are the types of networks you can use. But the issue is, of course, that networks are really there about making change happen. So how do professional managers work differently together across organisational boundaries? That's the challenge, really, of the health and social care age. If you're thinking about how we're stuck in the NHS, really at a sort of tipping point around the way we have to organise in an austerity climate with a very significant demand, when our health service was organised on a very different premise. So collaboration is the order of the day. It's what sorts of collaboration are most effective for change. And I would argue that transformation programmes are not the way to go about it. So let's have a look at some data around innovation. This is, if you look at the world of innovation and the world of change, what's really fascinating is the amount of organisations that put their effort on product performance and product systems. So they're really focusing on their offering, and they really want to innovate there. And what's really fascinating is that's not where they're generating value. In fact, less than 2% of projects produce more than 90% of the value. So when you're doing all this, if you're putting your effort into all of these, what it generates is actually not such a huge amount of product performance. Look up here. Look what is generating value. Networking and the business model. Now, the business model is not about necessarily about finance. I know it says that here, but it's about how you organise, the nature of the way your system is organised. Here's Kaiser Permanente. Just move me down a bit. There we go. So here they've analysed their innovation efforts. And again, look, way up here, a lot of innovation around product performance. In our world, that would be pathway redesign, for instance. Awful lot of work on that. Again, very small value creation. Look over here, exactly the same. Not a lot of effort, huge amount of return. So for me, this summarises a sense that if we could get networking and networks and relations better, we're likely to be able to generate value here. That focusing just on the product without focusing on the nature of the relationships and the collaborations, we're not going to generate the value we need. So what works in these collaborations? Well, we did a lit review of collaborations across the world, primarily around for improvement. And then I also did a review of all the evidence on integrated care, which are collaborative efforts. What have we found out? So this is the evidence around integrated care. So this is where it works. So what's really fascinating is that, I don't suppose you'll be surprised about any of this, but there are a couple of tenets here that are very important. I think that we have to have the whole system in the room. So our networks for change have to include citizens, and I don't see many that do that. But what's interesting about these integrated care evaluations, I thought, was this one here, which is that, and I think this is an issue for any change program in the NHS at the moment. Our systems leaders are getting distracted onto other projects. So they start things off, they leave it to the front line to get on with stuff. They don't necessarily see the need to be absolutely embedded in that change themselves and to be listening and supporting and enabling that change to happen. Particularly where sometimes as you start getting going on service level change in a network, you find that it brings up all sorts of issues around tariff, around whose job should sit where, around data, around governance. And those are things that only system leaders can sort out. And what we found when you look at these evaluations and you look at these collaborations is that the systems leaders are really struggling to keep a focus on that partnership. And if you look at high-performing health systems, one of the key tenets of high-performing health systems is that system leaders give up territory, and they're in service to that persistently. So they pay a lot of attention to the work of the network and to their role within it. So that's the first one. So what got in the way? Well, these are some of the things that you may be very familiar with, and I do think this is something that networks have got to really start pushing for. So I think you have to start demanding support further up the line. But one of the major issues is data. So if you're trying to do networks for learning or for delivery or for advocacy, you have to know what your baseline is. You have to know what's going on around here now, which means particularly if you're on a delivery network, like an accountable care system, that you have to have a collective understanding of what's going on now, and that has to be data enabled. So I see masses of data for performance and very little data for innovation and change. That's the ready to use, the sort of how do we find out how many GPs, what the demands of GP practice. Very, very few people know. We did a piece of work in Leeds, and this was a 4 GP practice. We just measured the number of phone calls they were getting first thing in the morning between 8 and 9 and when the phone lines opened. And surprisingly, they were having 2,000 phone calls. Now, they didn't know that. They didn't know what their demand was. They didn't know what their capacity was. All of you didn't know anything about flow will know it's really important to know what your demand is. So they knew their capacity, but they didn't know what happened to all those people that never got through. Maybe they ended up in A&E. Maybe they went home. Maybe they got better, but nobody knew. So if you don't know what your baseline is, you don't know what you're supposed to be trying to change. So that's pretty important for any network. Okay, second thing is about how do you make decisions across partners. Second major issue for me around how the NHS organises is it's very unclear when a decision is a decision. So I spend a lot of time, particularly with clinical leaders and network leaders, and even in the room, it's difficult to know when we've agreed a ground rule, when we've agreed what a value looks like in practice and how we enact that with each other. There's a lack of rigour here around decision making. In the desperation to get money for projects, people set expectations very high. So when they bid for funding, they say, oh, we can do all sorts of things. And I think some of my management consultant colleagues are also particularly guilty of this. They come to tenders, they present, they can do all sorts of things. It's very rare that it's followed through. The lack of ownership, lack of experience around how to engage citizens as partners, and the vacancy of support from the centre. By the centre, I mean NHS England. Okay, so what seemed to be evidence, what seemed across all of them to be an issue, if evidence really counted, then there would be data for decision making, and there would be a rigour to decision making. Citizen participation doesn't happen, and the issue is that these things take time. We have to be in it together on the long haul. Okay. I asked some health and social care leaders and what they thought was the most likely way of making a change in the system. If you're running a network, you need to know what your participants think about the way we're going to make a difference in the world. Have a quick look. This is just a good guide of a sort of temperature test, really, about how do people think things change through mergers, through asset-based community development, through disruption. That's usually technology or pharma. Incremental social change, better data, performance management. Those are the major models in use for how do we do change in the NHS at the moment. So this was a recent group of about 100 healthcare improvement leaders, but who were working through networks. So they mostly thought you need better data and some level of disruption. And this was a similar number, about 60 social care leaders in one part of the UK. Look where they think change needs to happen, right here, asset-based community development. So when you're working across the system, particularly across health and social care, here you can see that already we've got very different views about where you should place your effort and what it will make a change happen. And I think these things really matter, because when I asked both parties, neither knew what each are likely to think about the way you make change happen. So these perspectives, these underlying views, are really critical in any network, and you have to go find that out in your network. So I would say there's a level of scrutiny, investigation, inquiry you need to do in your network about what your members think about both how change happens and how you're going to go about change together. You might have seen this. This was a really nice article in the New England Journal of Medicine. And these are the few things that Bonner thought would, in his review of transformation programs, these are the things that he thought he found made the most difference. And this last point, teams often redesign local structure and process despite the lack of senior support, adequate data, capital, and it goes on, and remuneration. So you'll find that in the New England Journal of Medicine. But basically what he's saying is that if you look at all these transformation programs across the world, they're primarily about incremental change. Okay, so what's the future look like? I don't know if you know this. If you like, if you're really interested in how organisations are developing, you might be really interested in living systems work, and therefore you might be reading Capra and Maturana and Varella's Cognition, Friedrich Capra's Web of Life. But if you want just a pretty easy read on how organisations are transforming, I would have a look at Lau. Anyway, he's done these sort of phases of how, as human beings, we are evolving the way that we organise. And he talks about these types of organisations. Red is street gangs, mafia, that type of world. This is, thriving on chaos, power at the top, very macho. The metaphor here, he uses wolf pack. But you'll be familiar with that really in a high level of chaos, anxiety, threat. So those are the red organisations. So think mafia really, or think street gangs. In amber, hierarchical pyramids, command and control, value stability. And the metaphor here is the army. You think the Roman Catholic Church. Orange, here we go. Now this is about growth, innovation, management by objectives. So this is where organisations set very stretched targets. You can think about Tony Blair's government really trying to do that in our NHS. But Walmart, Coca-Cola, just go for it. And long as you are in concord with the organisation's principles, you've got a high level of freedom about how you go about it. Green, this is the world of compassion. of empowerment. Of if you've got motivated staff, you get better outcomes for citizens and patients. So that's a family. I would say that's what the sustainable improvement teams are really trying to focus on at the moment. How do we develop a culture? I would say, look, Michael West's work is here. And this is the world we're going into, the teal organisation, focusing on purpose, self-organising teams. If you really study Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, you'll see Joosterblok has a very small team of around 35. At the centre, absolutely focused on data, on ensuring that they meet all their performance targets for their commissioners. But apart from that, completely delegated to the numerous teams across the Netherlands and now across the world who are self-organising with delegated budgets. They organise their jobs, their work roles as peers. They have a coach who supports their difficult decision-making, but nobody at the centre tells them how to organise or what their work roles should look like or how much holiday they should have. All of that decision-making, the sorts of services they deliver and how they deliver those to the communities are absolutely delegated to team level. Absolutely fascinating. I know that Jos has been talking over here, and I know that some of that's been... Not everyone's really understood the nature of that being a highly professionalised model where teams peer review using fantastic IT platforms and scrutinise and support each other's practice and are hungry for learning. It's a fabulous organisation. So that's the trajectory. That's how organisations are changing. Where is the NHS now? Again, I asked some leaders, I don't know where you think, some leaders in the NHS. They think we're really stuck here. They think we're stuck in the amber orange, possibly getting to the green, nowhere near the teal. Now, what's really fascinating, if you look at how the future's organising, is that most corporates are moving from hierarchies into networks, and they don't see the boundaries of their organisation just here. They see the boundary of their organisation right the way around this parameter. So to include their alliances, their learning partners, their subcontractors, their delivery partners, their joint ventures, their franchises, there's a level of principle that engages here. Now, those organisations are beginning to move into this type of model, this team-based, teal-based organisation. Okay. That's where networks really come in. They're collaborative, fantastic structures. They're creative, high degree of principle, quite extended boundaries in this world. So, in order to innovate, we have to get rid of this traditional corporation model. We've got to get into a collaborative capability. So what do we know work? This is the proposition, our proposition for collaboratives in health. This is what I think they require based on high-performing health systems data. So data-enabled clinical decision-making, asset-based community development, cross-system learning and adaptation, network leadership, enable environment for collaboration. Got to learn from others. That's the proposition about what it's going to take. So what do we find from our place-based work on collaboratives? I ran a quality institute in Leeds for some years. So this is what we found really underpinned it. Strong relations in interprofessional working must be linked to some co-learning. What we find in collaboratives, so this is back to the delivery networks, the place-based change networks, is you have to learn together, and that has to be cross-discipline. In ours, we have finance, data, clinicians, citizens, managers, all learning together in service to making change happen. You have to have this cultural learning. Sometimes academia can be a really good host for a neutral space. Got to have your dedicated leadership, have to have some shared purpose and narrative that runs all the way through. Solve problems with data, get into this incremental change. And if you look at these characteristics, reciprocity, peer leadership, collaboration, those are real features of networks. They're absolutely critical for the future. I talked to you a little bit about data. You might have seen this before if you've seen any of my WebExes. This means that we've got to move from this model over here. If you ask people to put their hands up in a room about where the NHS puts its efforts, 90% of the NHS's data effort is focused on this side over here. Measurement for selection, accountability, consumerism, purchasing, regulation, contracting. You can go into any hospital in this country and there are rafts and rafts of data analysts. I've seen some inputting the friends and family data into a spreadsheet. I mean, how crazy is that? Where are maps and apps? Over here, if you go to high-performing health systems, 90% of their effort is over here, very small team on this side. So we know we've got to shift the focus, shift the way our data points towards data science for improvement. When I talk to data scientists who do this work, they're doing it in their weekends and in the holidays. We've got to move down this chain. We need to know more in any place than just demographic data. We've got to understand how the system operates to meet needs. We've got to know flow. We've got to know how people behave in the system. We've got to do some asset mapping. We've got to know how data is used for change, how it's informing. We've got to know how the system learns. Is it resilient? Have we done anything about fitness for the future? So that's a quick run through the things that I think really matter when we're talking about networks for change. I put some, oops, let me just move me here. I've got a Pinterest board where I post, good videos and websites. If you're interested, you're welcome to join and follow. I don't know if you like Pinterest at all. I think it's quite fun. And we've got our book out shortly. So I hope you have a really great day, and good luck with your network leadership.